90s, a veteran and father of three named Norman Browning took a job as a volunteer coach at Woodlawn High School in East Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Now, Browning had been educated by Baton Rouge's public schools, and he wanted to give back to the community. But very quickly, he realized that Woodlawn was very different from the school that it used to be. For one thing, there wasn't very much discipline. Teachers didn't have close relationships with parents. They didn't seem particularly interested in doing their jobs. Test scores were abysmal. And additionally, demographics had shifted dramatically. Students were poorer than they used to be, and there wasn't much of the fabled diversity that we're told is so important. More than half of the student body was black. Meanwhile, Baton Rouge and its schools were becoming increasingly violent. Currently, it's one of the 10 most dangerous cities in the entire country. Here's just one recent example of a common sight in Baton Rouge schools. Watch.
This was the scene before class began on Wednesday morning at an EBR Readiness High School. Fists flew and students fought with law enforcement.
If you can be en route to a fight, it's going to be 4735 East Brookstown, 4735 East Brookstown. Any additional units?
BRPD officers and EBR sheriff deputies rushed to the school where things quickly spiraled out of control, leaving some students scared and confused.
I'm just waiting on my mama to come. They pepper sprayed me. Everybody just trying to get out. Everybody just trying to go home at that point.
At least 10 teenagers were arrested. There were also moments where students and law enforcement got into it with each other.
I seen the police, he slammed some dude head to the wall, and he had slammed him on the floor and put him in handcuffs. It was just buku, the police was just hitting on the kids up in there.
Outside, a gun was found in the grass.
We had to use other people's phones to call our people. They had people, mamas pulling up, they fighting.
Parents quickly showed up to pick up their children, and some even got involved in the fight.
So, just a normal day at school, learning the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s. So there's a big fight in the school, and then the parents show up, and they get involved in the brawl, too. And then a gun turns up, and the cops are not remotely surprised by any of this. This kind of thing has been happening consistently in Baton Rouge for the past decade or more. As the Daily Mail reports, on a single day in 2013, Browning observed as many as 6 separate fights between unruly students in one day. Now, instead of shaking his head and moving on, which he very easily could have done, Browning decided on a different course of action. As the Daily Mail reports, Browning decided to help lead a breakaway movement to effectively secede from East Baton Rouge Parish and incorporate a new city called St. George. And this new city would have schools that admit students who actually want to learn and teachers who want to teach, and hopefully the students will have parents who want to parent. That's the idea. And the idea was a bit of a long shot. Other movements to incorporate new cities and secede, most notably the effort by Buckhead to secede in Georgia, have fallen short. And that's mainly because local politicians, including conservatives, have stood in the way, have prevented these people from, protecting their families and making their lives better. But after a campaign that took the better part of a decade, in 2019, voters finally approved the ballot initiative to create St. George. What followed were years of legal battles that ended finally last week when the Louisiana Supreme Court ruled in a 4-3 decision that St. George can indeed incorporate. St. George will be a 60-square-mile area with a population of more than 85,000 residents. For comparison, Baton Rouge is 76 square miles with a population of more than 200,000. And so that will make St. George one of the largest cities in the state. They'll have their own mayor, their own public services, their own city council. Watch.
Louisiana's highest court has sent its ruling down, paving the way for St. George to officially become its own city. Fox 44's Deshaun Johnson has more on this decision.
It's been an ongoing debate for years in the capital area, whether or not St. George should be incorporated into its own city. And today, that final decision was given the green light.
They had hoped that we would get this process done. They voted in this election.
I will proceed to have conversations to determine the best course of action.
The Louisiana Supreme Court ruled in favor for the new city with a 4-3 vote. Andrew Murrell, who was a lawyer for the St. George Incorporators, says that this ruling made today was something efficient for the area.
We are open for everyone. If you want more opportunity, you want a better life, you want a chance for lower crime, St. George.
Now, a key part of the Louisiana Supreme Court's ruling is that, contrary to what Baton Rouge claims, St. George has the financial means to be self-sustaining, and that's not surprising. Taxpayers in that area that's now known as St. George pay roughly 2/3 of the total tax revenue of the government of East Baton Rouge. but they receive only about 1/3 of the government's expenses in return. And despite paying all those taxes, St. George residents haven't been represented in the mayor's office in Baton Rouge in modern history. So in other words, St. George is vital for East Baton Rouge's economy. And in return for all the tax revenue St. George has generated, Baton Rouge has done basically nothing for St. George. They made their neighborhood more dangerous and their schools even worse. And on top of that, the people of St. George have no real representation in local government. So now East Baton Rouge isn't going to get that tax revenue anymore, at least not anywhere near the same amount. In fact, St. George residents are currently seeking tens of millions of dollars in back taxes that they've paid to the East Baton Rouge Parish government since 2019. So you have to wonder why this isn't happening more often. Governments that don't provide basic services or representation for their citizens don't deserve tax money from their citizens. That's a pretty intuitive principle. And there's no rule that says you can't make your own city if you want to. Quite the opposite. The right of free association is a fundamental part of the Constitution. So why isn't this more commonplace? Well, one reason might be that anyone who attempts to incorporate a sane, high-functioning city will, of course, be immediately defamed as racist. And predictably, that's been the main reaction from the left to the incorporation of St. George. There has been no reckoning about the failures of Baton Rouge's leadership whatsoever. There's been no discussion about, look, why would all these people want to leave in the first place? Instead, no, they're just racist. So here, for example, is a former president of the NAACP in Baton Rouge reacting to the ruling of the Louisiana Supreme Court. Watch.
Well, when you look at the basis of what they have publicly said about their argument to separate from the city of Baton Rouge, it's been based around better schools, right? Which in itself on its face doesn't make a ton of sense, right? Because you have some people that have supported this movement that have hold seats on our school board, right? And it's supposed to be their job to improve schools. So that notion in itself is kind of contradictory to what we see on its face. Not to mention, when you look at the makeup of the organizers and you don't have any people of color amongst them, it's hard not to make the assumption that this is something that might be racially driven. But at the same time, I have to be honest and say that the rhetoric, the narrative that they have pushed has been about better schools. But I don't see how separating our district, or separating the school district, can create better schools.
The other question that somebody like this will never ask is, when the residents of St. George say, hey, we don't want to be around all the crime and all the violence. We don't want that for our families. We don't want that for our children. That's what they're saying. And then his response is, oh, so you don't want to be around black people? So what are you saying exactly is the question. The NAACP guy starts off by saying that some of the people leading the secession movement are on the school board, so they're responsible for the failing schools. Apparently, the school board members should have used their vast influence in order to prevent brawls from constantly breaking out. They also should have forced the students to be smarter and work harder, and the teachers to care more about their jobs, and also forced the parents to actually parent their children. Then his argument devolves into accusing everybody in St. George of racism, of course. They didn't stay and try to fix East Baton Rouge's broken school system, so they must be bigots who just want to get away from black people. And the right thing for them to do is just keep sending their kids into these schools to try to fix it. Because that's what your kids are supposed to be doing, right? That's what you're supposed to be doing with your kids, is sending them into broken school systems in order to fix the school. Call me crazy, but I think the job of the school is to educate your kid, not the other way around. So if the school's not doing its job, then you take your kid out. This is one of the stock responses you'll hear on the left in response to the secession of St. George. For example, on Twitter, a black activist, quote unquote, named Samuel Sinyangwe wrote, they're seceding from a majority black city to create a whites-only enclave in Louisiana. Now, of course, just as a factual matter, not that facts matter to these people, but what this activist is saying about the new city isn't true. It's not a whites-only enclave, because there are black people living in it. Specifically, 12% of the population is black, which is roughly the same percentage of black people you'll find in Barack Obama's preferred island of Martha's Vineyard, by the way. It also mirrors the overall percentage of black people in the U.S. at large, which stands at around 14%. So in other words, these activists are calling St. George a whites-only enclave, which means they're also, in effect, calling the entire country a whites-only enclave. Additionally, Woodlawn High School, which I mentioned earlier, is within the limits of the new city of St. George. This school with a lot of black students attending is not being abandoned by this new city. The point is to improve its leadership so that there's more learning going on and maybe a little bit less fighting. As crazy of an idea as that is. Now, of course, if you let these activists talk a little more, it becomes very clear what they're really upset about. They're not upset about racism or whatever. They know that East Baton Rouge, like so many other cities in this country, is dysfunctional. And no sane person will want to continue funding it with their tax dollars. What bothers these activists is that their source of funding is about to go to zero. Their cash cow is abandoning them. They'll have to be productive for once and solve their own problems without taking other people's money and wasting it. That NAACP president in Baton Rouge eventually gets around to kind of admitting that. Listen.
Not to mention, when you look at how they're planning on supporting themselves, it's pulling a lot of the resources and the tax bases from Baton Rouge, stuff that has been used to keep our city stable, right? So
I think Sharon Weston Broom, the mayor there, said the city of Baton Rouge could lose at least $46 million annually as a result of this.
At least, and probably more, right? So when you take all that into account, this is going to hurt the underserved. This is going to be paid for on the backs of poor black folks, right? Because
so it's pulling a lot of the resources and the tax bases from Baton Rouge, stuff that is used to keep our city stable. This is going to be paid for on the backs of poor black folks, he says. There's finally some honesty there. It's true that without St. George, Baton Rouge will probably have a lot of financial problems to deal with, but the people responsible for those problems are not living in St. George. They're running Baton Rouge, which is losing population by the day. As the Louisiana Supreme Court said in its decision, quote, Baton Rouge has arguably experienced a windfall by collecting taxes in St. George without returning proportionate money and services. Incorporation will allow the money paid by St. George citizens to stay in St. George. The record establishes the population of St. George is increasing. Conversely, the population of Baton Rouge is declining. So as St. George creates its new school system and builds out its infrastructure, it's very likely that Baton Rouge's population will continue to decline. And that's why already there's an effort by Baton Rouge activists to get the Louisiana Supreme Court to reconsider its decision. But that will probably fail, as it should. For one thing, some of the economic success of St. George will almost certainly benefit Baton Rouge in a variety of ways. St. George will keep many more people in the area, and the residents there will still pay for some services provided by the government of East Baton Rouge. But more importantly, if St. George continues to thrive, it will send a very clear signal to dysfunctional governments all over the country. And that signal is, stop wasting our tax dollars or we will leave. And we will take our tax dollars with us. That's how our system was always supposed to work. Our country was founded on the principle that governments cannot lawfully tax people without representing them or working for their benefit. And with the secession of St. George from the capital city of Louisiana, for the first time in recent memory, that principle is back. Hopefully there's much more to come.